I am speaking to you about Palestine and also about Turtle Island from another island, the island of Manhattan, which is the ancestral home of the Lenape and the Canarsie peoples, who I have never ceded their rights to their lands. Fortunately, Manhattan still has the name that was given it by its original occupants and owners. I'm honored, actually, to be one of the speakers giving the James Graff lecture this evening. I happen to have met Jim long ago, and I can testify to the fact that he was a dedicated supporter of Palestinian rights. I'm going to be talking this evening about the book that Yara mentioned, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. And I think it's appropriate that we're speaking, Alma and I, in an event where the issues around Turtle Island, around colonialism in the North American continent, and settler colonialism in Palestine are linked, because the one illuminates the other. I am going to talk a little bit about my book, but I won't give you a boring academic talk, I promise. I'll try and highlight a few things that I think reveal the settler colonial nature of the struggle that has been going on in Palestine for more than a century now. This book, I should say, for those of you who might be daunted by the fact that I'm an academic and I've written a number of books, this book is a little bit different from anything I ever wrote. It includes a lot of first-person material. It includes a lot of family material. It attempts to frame an argument in terms of what happened to people I knew, or people in my family, or people I knew of. And so it's very, very different than anything I've ever written. A lot of it is in the first person. I describe events that I witnessed or was a part of from when I was a kid and was listening to stories that my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles told me, to when I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation and was participating for 3 years in negotiations with the Israelis. I'm going to focus to begin with on the title. Why did I choose the title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine? I am trying to shatter with that framing of this struggle a number of entirely false perspectives. One of them is that this is a struggle that's been going on since time immemorial. It is not. It is a modern struggle that is a result of settler colonialism. Before modern nationalism, before the Zionist movement arose in the late 19th century, there was no conflict in Palestine between Arabs and Jews, none whatsoever, nor had there been for centuries before. Anyone who tries to tell you that this is something that's been going on for a very long time is in fact obscuring the reality. This started with an attempt by the Zionist movement to implant a new population in an already populated land at the expense of the indigenous population in order to turn it from the land of Palestine into the land of Israel. This is where the conflict begins, and this is why I describe it, one of many reasons that I describe it as a war on Palestine rather than a conflict. I try to avoid using that term. Conflict gives you another mistaken impression, which is that these are two equal parties. So you have a conflict between France and Germany, or you have a conflict between Algeria and Morocco. This is not a conflict between two states or between two peoples, though there are, of course, two peoples in the presence right now. It is, in fact, a very unequal struggle, one which has the characteristic imbalance of any struggle between an indigenous population and between a settler colonial project backed by enormous external power. And this therefore is the second reason that I chose the title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, because it was a project of implantation of what developed into a national movement. What Zionism was trying to create was a national project, and it was successful in so doing. To those of us who live in North America, that is not a surprise. A settler colonial project can turn into a national project. I live in an American, United States national project. Most of you live in a Canadian national project, which resulted from a settler colonial war on an indigenous population in order to replace it with a settler population, an immigrant population brought in from. from outside. So that's the second reason that I've chosen this title. The third reason is that this is not just a conflict between Zionism and the indigenous Palestinian population. Obviously, that's part of it. This is not just what has developed into a conflict between two national groups. This is also, and has always been, a struggle involving massive external support for this settlement project. No colonial settler project ever succeeds, can even be contemplated without that kind of support. And that support the Zionist movement had from the moment that Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which it claimed that it was entitled to give over Palestine as what was called in the Balfour Declaration a national home for the Jewish people, to a group that comprised at that time maybe 6% of the population, and which, with British assistance, of course, was allowed to grow and was allowed to develop institutions. I will go into briefly the Balfour Declaration, because I think it shows a number of the features of this specific settler colonial project. One of them being, of course, erasure of the existing population. Not just physical erasure, not just physical elimination or removal, but erasure of names and erasure of their very existence as an entity and as a group that has rights within the country being targeted. And in the case of the Balfour Declaration, this was made explicit. The Balfour Declaration talks about the creation in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It doesn't mention the overwhelming majority of the population. They are not mentioned. The word Palestine, the word Palestinians, the word Arab don't exist. They don't appear in the Balfour Declaration. And what is described as the existing non-Jewish population in that very short statement of the British government is not entitled to national existence. It's not entitled to political rights, which the Zionist movement is described as having in the Balfour Declaration. Instead, it's described as having only civil and religious rights. And so this erasure begins at the very moment that Britain moves in as the patron of the Zionist movement in 1917. This external patronage continues. And this, again, is why this conflict, why this struggle, I should say, is so exceedingly imbalanced. Britain continues to back the Zionist movement right up through World War II. It crushes a major Palestinian revolt at the end of the 1930s. 10% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British, who brought in over 100,000 troops in the 3 years between 1936 and 1939, in the process of crushing this Palestinian revolt. So this was not a war waged in the first instance at the beginning by the Zionist movement itself. It was waged by Britain, the greatest imperial power of the age, with 100,000 British troops, the Royal Air Force, and so forth. So that's why I have chosen the title that I chose, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. I'm trying to shatter with the title and with the argument behind it a number of powerful myths. The time immemorial myth, the idea that these were two equal parties and it's simply a conflict between two national groups, and the idea that it was just Zionism versus the Palestinians. In fact, there was always a big fat imperial thumb on the scale, whether the thumb of Britain up until World War II, whether the thumb of the United States and the Soviet Union, which pushed the partition resolution through the United Nations General Assembly in 1947, whether the thumb of Britain and France, which fought together with Israel against Egypt in 1956, and which armed Israel for the 1967 war, or whether the enormous thumb of the superpower, the United States, which has been Israel's primary backer since the 67 war. Let me say a little bit now about the subtitle to the book, the subtitle being A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. Every colonial conquest has engendered resistance. This is always the case everywhere, whether it's a simple direct colonial conquest, Britain conquering Egypt or conquering India, or whether it's a settler colonial process where there's an attempt to replace the indigenous population with a European settler population, as has happened in Canada, in the United States, and has happened in Palestine. In every case, this process, this colonial process, necessarily and inevitably engenders resistance. Always, Every time this has happened, the colonial power codes this resistance in derogatory terms as savagery, as banditry, as terrorism. This is what colonial powers do. They would never admit that what they are doing has produced the resistance. They would never admit that because of their land seizure, because of their elimination of populations, because of their driving people out of their homes, those people are resisting. That would not do. It's absolutely necessary to code the resistance of the indigenous to, in particular, settler colonialism as banditry, savagery. You can choose your word. The English use the term banditry in talking about India. North America, the term savagery is used. With the Palestinians, the most commonly used term is terrorism. These are derogatory terms to describe an inevitable process of resistance. So that explains resistance. Let me say a little bit about settler colonialism. It has been alleged that the very use of this term is a slur and a smear on the good name of Zionism and the State of Israel. It has been asserted that anyone who uses this term is in fact an anti-Semite. And it has been argued that this is proof of a certain kind of innate, inveterate hostility to the Zionist project and later on to the State of Israel. Now, I am going to now bring up a text, which I'm going to go over briefly, by the father of what has become the most powerful ideological trend in modern Israeli politics, a man by the name of Zev Jabotinsky. He founded what was called the revisionist strand or the revisionist trend in Zionism. He was a major leader in the 1920s and 1930s. He was eclipsed by labor leaders, labor Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, but his successors, people like Menachem Begin, people like Yitzhak Shamir, people like Ariel Sharon, people like Benjamin Netanyahu, people like Ehud Olmert, people like almost every Israeli prime minister since 1977 were followers of the revisionist trend in Zionism that was originated by Jabotinsky. So Jabotinsky is an important figure. There are illegal Israeli settlements all over the occupied territories named for Zev Jabotinsky. Givat Ze'ev, there are half dozen named for Zev Jabotinsky, and others that have his name in other forms. So I'm going to bring up now a text of Jabotinsky's, which I think helps us to understand what we mean when we talk about settler colonialism. This is a text taken from an article written by Zev Jabotinsky in 1923. And Jabotinsky wrote the following. He said, and I quote, you have it in front of you, every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. He went on to say, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. Finally, he said, if you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands and falls on the question of armed forces. Now, why do I bring you this text? I do so because it proves every point that I've been making. It proves, when Jabotinsky talks about an iron wall, he means the iron wall of British bayonets and RAF planes that were necessary to crush the Palestinians in 1936-39. This was not the Zionists doing. It was done at their behest, and it was done in service of British imperial interest, but it was done by Britain. So we are talking about a much more complex struggle than one simply between a group of Zionists and a group of indigenous Palestinians. The second reason I cite it is because Jabotinsky hasn't the slightest illusions about the fact that colonization engenders resistance. He says that in the first quote. Every native population in the world resists colonists. Finally, I mention it because of his repeated use of the term colonization. Zionist colonization. If you wish to colonize a land, native populations will resist colonists. This is not a slur on Zionism. This is a description by perhaps the most influential Zionist leader of the 20th century, in terms of ideology at least, of his own movement. And this was something the Zionists did not shy away from in the 1920s and 30s. They tried to hide it, they tried to disguise it, but ultimately, many institutions of the Zionist project were self-described as colonizing institutions. One of the institutions that did much to acquire land for the Zionist project was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. So when I use the term settler colonialism, I am using the self-description of some of the forefathers, if you want, of the Zionist project and of the state of Israel, for which, as I've said, numerous settlements, illegal settlements on stolen Palestinian land, dot the landscape of the West Bank, and an ideology which many of the followers of Jabotinsky ended up being prime ministers of the state of Israel. I want to say one last thing before I conclude, because I understand I was given about 20 minutes and I have just a little bit of time left, and I don't want to impose on you, and I don't want to take any time away from Alma, who has equally important things to talk about this evening. And what I want to talk about, just to conclude, is to argue how important that this understanding, this narrative that I've laid out for you, and that's laid out obviously in much greater detail in the book, is to a just and equitable resolution of this struggle. Burying these realities, burying what settler colonialism has done in North America or anywhere else, will not lead to peace and a sustainable solution. People must understand where the present comes from, and the present in Palestine and the present in Turtle Island as a whole, whether the Canadian part or the United States part, begins here with this kind of a settler colonial project. In fact, when the British began the settlement and the colonization of Turtle Island, they were in the process of doing the same thing to Ireland. Ireland was in fact the first British settler colony. North America and the Caribbean were the second. Palestine was the last. The difference, of course, was that Britain was settling British natives in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and in other places in East Africa and elsewhere. It was settling people who formed a separate national group in Palestine. But Britain was the settler colonial power that was behind all of what we're talking about in the different parts of Turtle Island, whether the Canadian part or the United States part, and in many other parts of the world, South Africa, Kenya, New Zealand, Australia, obviously, but also finally in Palestine. So these are actually integrally linked in the thought and in the practice, in the personnel of the settler colonial power, which was behind every one of these projects that we're talking about tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Khalidi. It's very important for us to challenge the colonial narrative of history, right, which has often sought to narrate the story of Palestinian dispossession as the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and then the Nakba. And so when you talk about the Arab revolts and you talk about this really important piece of resistance, I think what we do when we talk about that is we reclaim that history, and we challenge this colonial narrative that the British wrote off our land and then off we went in 48, right? But rather we talk about this history of resistance. So thank you so much for that. On that note, I would like to invite Alma. I'm going to spotlight you here and just ask you to unmute and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. And thank you, Doctor, for your talk. It's interesting that these truths are now beginning to come into the open now, that we're being able to talk and speak our truths. Jabawe kwenyon tliwis, zabu taxi dapid, blastu kewil no, Wabanaki. I come to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Eastern Wabanaki. I'd like to share because it reminded me when I heard the doctor speaking about these truths. It reminded me of a hope prophecy that I've heard our people talk about quite extensively, and that is the prophecy of this two-headed serpent. That there was a snake, two heads but one tail, but it was two heads of the same snake that wrapped itself. It would wrap itself around the world and begin to crush the life out of the earth, and that there would come a time when the two-headed serpent would begin to devour itself. And so I also want to share a little bit, first of all, that our people were told about the original instructions, and even right to this day, we still have many of those teachings that were kept underground and protected by certain families that were held responsible for these things. And so one of those original instructions is they talked about the time when the earth was peopled, and that after all of our relatives in the natural world were put in place, that the people, we were the last. The four sacred colors of man were placed at the four corners of the earth. And each of those people, those sacred colors, each of those people were given a path to walk on. And they were given a bundle whereby that they would be able to live a good and happy life right here on this earth. And that all life on this earth was sacred. And that our world was about balance and harmony, and that our world included the sacred circle of life, the sun, the moon, the earth, the air, the stars, the water, plants, the trees, life, birth and death, daylight and darkness, the balance. That all of these things were in constant motion in a never-ending cycle of life. This was a part of our world. This was a part of our traditional relationship. And to live a good and happy life in an Indigenous worldview as such as this one, it was necessary to plug into the spiritual aspect of the life of all living things. And that this life was based on the extended family, not just mom, dad, and the kids, but aunties and uncles and so on, and an extended family. And so we were taught from birth how to walk gently on this earth and how to respect all other living things and to take only what we needed in order to live a good life, and to seek the balance and harmony, and never forget to show gratitude for the gifts that were given so freely to us by our first mother and the great mystery. In our language, we can speak to the great mystery. We can speak both the female side of life of all things and the male side of life of all things in our language. And our ceremonies were the glue that held our societies together. This was the relationship that we had. And it was an important role these ceremonies played the overall well-being of our traditional Indigenous peoples. And so in contrast, what was brought here And I have to tell you that colonization did not begin here. As Doctor pointed out, colonization was very well crafted by the time they brought it here. They had practiced in many other places, in many other countries on indigenous populations. But by the time they got here, it was very well crafted. And I believe the part of colonization was what they call in this time, they call it the burning times. And because the original instructions that were given, the bundles that were carried amongst those peoples were carried primarily with the mothers, the women. Of course, that was usurped. That power and knowledge was usurped and taken away from the women during the hundreds of years of burning women. And they called them witches. They called them pagans and called them all kinds of names. And if you had a wart on your nose or a one crooked eye, it didn't matter. Any excuse was used to destroy and usurp the power that the women carried. That was part of colonization. Because we know that when they came here, the first thing they did was to call us witches and to call us pagans and to call us these names. And they began to cast their greedy eyes on our lands and the wealth of our resources. And in the Western hierarchy, they created, it's a man-made structure. It's not a cycle. It's not a cycle of life at all. It's a hierarchy where they placed their God at the top of the hierarchy, and they placed their power, individuals, where a handful of people can control the masses. And it's about power and control, not about balance and harmony at all. It's about exactly what Doctor was talking about. The whole entire system was created where the few at the top control the masses. And to be successful in this worldview, one must plug into the economy and to compete with others to get to the top, because the measure of success is the accumulation of wealth and material things. Totally despiritualized the world, the natural world, if I would put it that way. They totally despiritualized the natural world, which really separates the head from the heart. And the accumulation of wealth and material things is how success was measured by individuals, nuclear families, communities, provinces, and countries. This life is based on competition, war, aggression, power, and the delegated authority from the top down. So that's a little bit of perspective on different worldviews from an Indigenous perspective and from a Western perspective. So in the beginning of colonization, the Pope in 1447 issued a papal bull legitimizing the slave trade. And then 3 years after that, it broadened the license of stealing people to stealing land and goods as well. This European declaration of war on the world, that's what it was. It was a declaration of war on the world. It unleashed an unprecedented wave of genocidal behavior, and it was commanded by Christian states in our experience here. In 1492, 3 European ships under the command of Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of what became to be called the Americas. With this began an invasion, an occupation and colonization that would forever change the world of the indigenous peoples living here. A war aimed at initiating the destruction of the indigenous people, occupation of our territories, and the plundering of our natural wealth and health of our beloved territory. Explorers and privateers of courage and resourcefulness conquering the world for their honor and privilege of their kindly kings and queens was a beautiful fairy tale that was the story that they told themselves and that they told everybody else. But when we read this history, we did not see a fairy tale of noble, courageous explorers at all, with resourceful intentions for their honor and privilege of their kindly kings and queens. What we saw were invaders, thieves, and slaves and rapists, which in fact is what the evidence shows, a premeditated crime. A systematic campaign of genocide and colonization was waged against the indigenous people by European colonizers. Almost identical campaigns were being carried out in Africa and other parts of the world, as we both said before. It didn't begin here. It was already well crafted by the time it reached our shores. A systematic campaign of genocide and colonization was waged against the indigenous people here. Almost identical campaigns. Western society continued blindly, ignorantly, and intentionally to follow its present course of action, and with a superiority attitude along with it, to determine the assimilation of indigenous people into their processes. So the European colonizer knew the things that gave us strength, and that gave us the strength to resist colonization. To name a few was our way of life, our relationship with the world, with our territory, our land, our nationhood, our extended family concepts. Those were the things that gave us the strength. Our cultural way of life, our spirituality, which was completely rooted, deeply rooted in the land from which we come, and our connection to that life, our worldview, our relationship to our lands and our waters. So the common purpose of this Western society, which is based on colonization and the subjugation of indigenous people and Black people for that matter, and the occupation of indigenous land for the purpose of taking and exploiting the natural resources and treasures of the earth, of which profit and material gain was their main goal. The society was given no consideration, and right to this day, or ignorant of or indifferent to the negative and destructive effects upon us indigenous people, on our land, or even the earth herself. In this society, the ruling class, the segment of society which maintains the superior and dominant position of political and economic classes, these are the people who own and control vast corporations and or are the heads of state who influence economics and political decisions directed toward their own interests and no one else. So the genocide, the Indian bands and reserves and residential schools were used as laboratories for our colonization here. training and conversion to European values, systems, religion, and ways of life. Every aspect of Indian life was controlled by the government, the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, by priests, and by the RCMP. They were minimum security institutions, these reserves, and they still are today. Even though the colonizers had military might and the control in that sense, these were the things they did to try to wipe us out, I guess, if you could say. They proceeded to destroy our being as Indigenous people, to negate our true identity. They called us Indians. We're not Indian. I'm a Wolastoqweek, my people. The Wolastoq is the river, the beautiful and bountiful river in my territory that runs to the heart of my territory. And we are the Wolastoqweek, the people of the beautiful river. That's what it means in our language. They destroyed our way of life. They systematically dismantled us as original nations, refusing to acknowledge the law, because this was not something that we were, these things were in law. They were protected by treaty. They were protected by the Royal Proclamation, and in their own agreements, they violated without batting an eye. So the total systemic campaign of genocide was waged against Indigenous nations by European colonizers, and it continues to this day. So colonization, and I think you heard this from the doctor, colonization and war are one and the same. So war involves the use of all the elements of natural power, national power, such as diplomacy, military force, economics, ideology, technology, and culture. All the elements of war have been used by the Canadian state against the Indigenous people here and around the world. The effects of war and colonization leaves a bitter pill in our mouth. You know, when we look at the conditions in our communities today, we realize that this is a normal human response to very painful and extraordinary human experiences that we've been put through. We have been put through the meat grinder. We're not surprised when hamburger comes out the other end. Some of the conditions we find ourselves in is that there are many feelings of inferiority, because for so long we've been told that we just don't measure up. So many things that have been done and said. We have a little progress towards addressing the oppressed conditions that we are in. The conditions that keep us oppressed do not change because the government actively prevents any movement towards any fundamental change to its system. This prevents even the thought that change is necessary or possible. Create conditions of self-sabotage and self-destruction, intergenerational violence and abuse, frustrated and angry, where we have Indigenous people harboring hostile attitudes towards white people, while grasping at the crudest and most simplistic formula for understanding our own oppression. The highest rate of suicide in the country, and the highest infant mortality rate, the lowest life expectancy, and the disproportionately high rates of AIDS and cancer, addictions, imprisonment, and the lowest levels of income. Tens of thousands of children were taken from their family from their people, from their community, and fostered out to non-Indigenous family unit. The residential school run by the churches. In the name of Jesus, they did all this. Intergenerational patterns of abuse in the community resulted from a legacy of residential school and the foster care system. The residential school, we hear so much about all of the atrocities. My brother was a residential school survivor. And all of his 92 years, he said he could never trust. He could never trust. They were hungry. They had government experimenting on these children, keeping them starving. He said, we worked in the fields, we grew crops, we worked in the barns, we milked the cows. I don't know what they did with the food, he said, because we didn't get it. And when he worked in the barns, he said he used to bring oats and fill his pockets with oats to take it inside because he knew the little ones inside would be hungry. He said we were hungry all the time. The government paid these schools. The government paid, and the policy, they told our people, oh, well, we're gonna teach your children how to read and write. But the policy, the truth is, the policy was to take the Indian out of the child. That was Canadian policy, and that the churches were willing participants. And they didn't care which church it was, as long as it was a Christian church, and pretty well all of them were willing participants that run these schools. So, you know, we have to continue to go forward. We cannot, we have to find out, because we're at a time of crisis right now. Not just us, not just us. The earth herself, and I go back to that two-headed snake. The life is being crushed from this earth, from the world right now. We're in a crisis, all of us. We are on the cusp of the sixth mass extinction on this planet. I have to tell you, my people still hold the key to the continuation of life on this planet. And there will come a day when those people who have lost their way are going to come to us. But I will tell you another thing, that life on this planet, all life is connected. Our people understood that, and we continue to understand that. All life is connected. And nobody knows what the critical strand in that cycle of life, in that web of life, nobody knows what that critical strand is. And once that critical strand is broken, life will begin to unravel on this planet, and it will unravel faster and faster and faster. And at some point, they will be so afraid, they're going to come rushing to us. But I will tell you, it will be too late. At that time, it will be too late. So it's very important that we sit up and take note of the conditions we find ourselves in. It's not just me telling you this. Your own scientists are telling you. They're telling you. They're not lying. They're telling you the truth. And in the beginning, I will end with this. In the beginning of time, when the earth was young, there was never anything that was more beautiful that was ever created. Everything functioned in perfect harmony and balance. I would leave you too with, since we have some avid readers here, that I would like to mention a book that has been written. It's called The Gatherings. And we had a group of the Wabanaki people met together on many occasions with settlers, both in Maine and here in the Atlantic region. And we held gatherings and we talked about settler and Indigenous relations. And I think there's 6 Indigenous writers that wrote their experiences in this book. And Shirley Hager is the author of the book. She gathered all of these stories together and she put them in a book. And the publisher is the University of Toronto Press, the University of Toronto Press. So if anybody's interested in reading that book, it would shed a little bit more light from several various different perspectives. So that's with that, I would welcome questions if people have questions. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alma. Thank you for those reflections. You know, I was thinking as you were reflecting about the role of the churches, because they play a role in Palestine too, and that's something that our organization is consistently dealing with. But I noticed there's already a question about that, so I'll leave it. I'll leave that reflection to come back up in the question and answer period. And I'll also look for a link to that book to share in the chat in just a few moments. And on that note, I want to begin to open up to question period. But before we do that, I guess what I'll say is you can see at the bottom of your screen, it says Q&A. And if you click on that, you can submit your question through there. And while you're thinking of your questions, I would like to introduce Natalie Fashe. For any of you who were in the Toronto area a few years ago during our production of Tales of a City by the Sea, you might recognize Natalie. Natalie is a Palestinian Jordanian singer, choral practitioner, community engaged artist, and poet. She leads vocal ensemble experiences rooted in empowerment, cultural awareness, and activism. Natalie writes poetry on themes of cultural identity, nature, and humanity. And as a pedagogue, leader, and visionary, Natalie is part of the 2022 Global Leaders Program, a pursuit of transforming systems by centering equity and justice in organizational and music practices. And I'm going to invite Natalie to perform a song for us. I'm just going to spotlight you there.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here amongst all of you, and thank you for everyone for showing up to this very important talk. Yeah, I'll be singing a Palestinian folk song. It's called Halalalaya. It's a very, very well-known folk song, and it's mostly about originally it's about a woman, or a very young woman, who falls in love, but her mother doesn't let her be with the person she loves, and every time she falls in love, her mother doesn't approve. So it's a folk song that really is one of my favorite ones, and I hope you enjoy this one. هلالاليا هلالاليا عيني يا فلسطينية كل القوافل رجعت وين راح الزمن فيها بنتي قالت لأمها يما ظلمتيني أول عريس إجا ليش ما أعطيتيني ثاني عريس إجا عيني يا فلسطينية كل الجوافر رجعت وين راح الزمن فيها لأطلع راس الجبل واشرف على الوادي وأقول يا مرحبا نسمها وبلادي يا ربي زخت مطر سيغرق الوادي واحمله ظهري جسر وقطعك ليا عيني يا فلسطينية كل الجوافر رجعت وين راح الزمن فيها. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you. Every time, I have so many fond memories actually of that song, and of the Tales of a City by the Sea, which was a play that we put on in Toronto that you sang in and worked on the music of. So thank you for joining us. And I noticed that Curtis put the name of the book that Alma had mentioned, The Gatherings, in the chat box. So you can search up that book and I think purchase it directly through UToronto Press. And so we have some questions. So I guess I'm going to move us over to the Q&A. So the first question, which sort of relates to that point about the churches that I also thought of as you were speaking, Alma. So the question says, Alma spoke of how for the colonizers, God is at the top of the hierarchy in the colonization project on Turtle Island. And so the question to Dr. Khalidi is, do you also see this playing out in the colonization of Palestine? If so, in what ways? And can either or both of the speakers give some pointers on what we can do to address this intersectional solidarity from Turtle Island to Palestine?
So it seems like there's part of a question for each of us. I'll start and then maybe Alma can continue. As Alma eloquently made clear, religion goes hand in hand with colonialism. It always has, everywhere. And as she also said, and as I mentioned myself, it didn't start in Turtle Island, and it certainly didn't start in Palestine. When you look at English settler colonialism in Ireland, religion is a crucial element in the usurpation of Ireland and in the dispossession of the Irish and in the oppression of the Irish. And this is between Christians. This is Protestant versus Catholic use of religion. It's true also in Palestine on multiple levels and through multiple registers. Christian Zionism, or what can be called Christian Zionism, goes back to the early 19th century in Great Britain. The idea originating with people like Lord Shaftesbury and many others in the early 1830s and 40s of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was predicated on an understanding of religion, but also involved completely ignoring and ultimately usurping the place of the indigenous population. The Palestinians don't figure in that vision. And that is true to this day with certain strands of evangelical Protestantism, which see that the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is absolutely necessary to the second coming and to a whole series of apocalyptic events, which are understood to be prefigured in the revelation of St. John the Divine. I'm not a theologian. Father Asadi can probably speak to this way better than I can, but there is no question that religion has always gone hand in hand with colonialism, and that was the case in Britain, in Britain's use of religion in Palestine. Many members of the British cabinet that approved the Balfour Declaration and that were engaged in this oppression and repression of the Palestinian people, believed that what they were doing was religiously sanctioned and religiously justified.
Thank you, Dr. Khalidi. Alma, I think just to reiterate, it was that there was a bit there around in what ways can we address this intersectional solidarity, keeping in mind too, I think that many of the people here are from faith-based communities, right? So these are really important conversations for us.
Well, it seems to me, we're all programmed. Everybody's programmed now for generations. So it appears as though if we want to change it, we can't keep doing the same thing. We can't continue to believe the same thing that we've been believing all along. We have to change. Something has to change. So the belief system is what has to change. And my recommendation would be for people, and especially the women, should look for the original instructions that were given in the beginning of time. Look and those bundles that were intended for you, that were given to the 4 sacred colors of man. Each one was given a path to walk on. The path is not lost. The people have gotten lost. They have to look for that. They have to change what they're believing. It's going to be a monumental task for many. They probably won't be able to because for generations they've been programmed. But there are some that will remember that I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, because I'm speaking to your spirit. Your spirit knows. Your spirit knows. And, there's a new science now that's coming to the surface, whereby we transmit, as women, we transmit ancestral memory from one generation to the next. And unfortunately, we also transmit trauma, but once we heal from that, and I think, for the people in the countries, I feel sorry for the Palestinians. I absolutely understand what Doctor was talking about. And the only thing I know is that I hear about the atrocities that are happening to them. And I don't believe anything I hear, and only about half of what I see, because you don't know who's telling the truth anymore. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know. So I know from our experience as Indigenous people, it's not much different, except theirs is much more violent. It seems to me there's a lot more violence there because they're fighting back. That's their way of protecting themselves, I guess. But we like I said, we hold the key to the continuum of life on this planet. If there's no air, if the water is poisoned, if there's no longer any trees that will grow, nobody's going to live here. Life just won't, nobody will be able to live here. And what kind of a legacy are we leaving to our children? That's the importance of really being mindful about, and that question is a good question. What can we do? Well, what we have to do is to stop doing what we've been doing and to change what we believe, because what you believe is what you become. You will become that. All the things that were done to my people were done in the name of Jesus Christ. And now, just they say that was their God. Like, it just doesn't. It's so insane. I don't understand. what this belief is. It just doesn't make any sense from where I sit, from my perspective. So I know though that there is another way. There's another way, and people have to find those bundles and pick them up. That's what I think. Restore the balance. This balance of this on this planet has to be restored because it's way off balance right now. Out of balance, and it's caused by the powers that were in control, which is the Western system.
Thank you, Alma. On that note, you brought up the role of women, the role of mothers, and there's a question here which says, so there's one of our attendees is actually currently writing a paper on the role of mothers in resisting settler colonialism, looking at how settler colonialism targets the reproductive health of Indigenous women and Palestinian women to sustain itself. And their question is, in the context of Turtle Island, how has settler colonialism targeted Indigenous women via reproductive health?
Well, I mean, they're murdering our women. Where women, hundreds of women are going missing and murdered. They even had an inquiry, but nothing has been done. The inquiry's on the shelf somewhere, So, yeah, I mean, the experiments when they were in residential school, many of the women were. What do you call that? So they can't have children. They were sterilized. In the residential schools. Yeah. That's all part of it. It's all part of it. They want to destroy the women because the women are the heart, especially in our society here. In many of our tribes, we're matrilineal tribes. So we take from our mother's side, eh? We follow our mother's side. And the women, even in our ceremonies and everything, the women are central because we are the life givers. We're the first teachers. We are, and our men, our men honored that. Our men, traditional men honored that. And it was the missionaries who told the men to beat their wives. And the men thought they were crazy. They said, how can you tell me that, as a priest you don't get married. You're not married. So how can you tell me what to do? And to beat my wife. They thought it was just insane. But that's what they were told to do. Beat your wife. You wear the pants in the family. This was all a part of, colonizing our mind, what we believe in, changing all of what we believe. So if we want to change it back to something that's going to restore the balance on this planet, it seems to me we have to change what was. We have to decolonize our minds and our thinking and our beliefs.
This was something that I also thought as you were both speaking, because just to expand even the analysis and the question a bit and kind of bring it over to you, Dr. Khalidi, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning was about how 10% of Palestinian men were either killed or injured or forced out during the British occupation, British mandate. Recently, I also learned through engaging with Salman Abu Sitta's work about the Palestinian labor camps between 1948 and 1955, which also targeted oftentimes able-bodied men. And just thinking about how colonization is gendered, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that in the case of Palestine.
I was actually preparing to answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A. And you threw me that one. Well, obviously it is gendered in many, many ways. One of the things that we learned that actually Alma mentioned in terms of the way in which colonization took place on this continent is that one of the weapons that's used is rape. And another weapon that's used is to exploit traditional patriarchal relationships in order to control the population better and to introduce new modern patriarchal notions, Western modern patriarchal notions. All of these involve gender, obviously. There is an important element in Palestinian resistance, which is that much of the leadership at important phases is taken by women. And quite frequently, this is resented by men. There's a wonderful film about the Intifada by, I think, Julia Basha, I believe, made it, in which she shows when many of the men were imprisoned, the people who took over were the women. And they did an excellent job, of course. And when the men were released, of course, they immediately pushed them aside. And so, there are many, many issues relating to gender in Palestinian society. Femicide, spousal abuse, other issues, which are partly a result of the trauma inflicted by occupation, which are partly a result of the trauma inflicted as a result of dispossession. People turn in on themselves when they're abused and oppressed from the outside. This is exactly the process that Alma's talking about in terms of suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, and so on and so forth among First Nations. It's true in African-American communities in the United States. It's true among poor people and white people in Appalachia. And it's true in Palestinian society as well. And that has a gendered nature to it. The women will bear the brunt always of these issues. And there are many, many other things I could talk about, the way in which gender and sexuality are used by the occupation intelligence services to force people to collaborate, the ways in which honor, the idea of honor and family and shame are exploited. And these are all gendered issues by the occupation authorities. And these are traditional tools used by colonizers, over many, many centuries, refined and developed, of course, by the Israeli state in the last 70-something years.
And I think too that one of the other things women are going to have to come to terms with is the fact that when I said that we transmit ancestral memory, so the memory of the burning times are also transmitted, and right to this day, the fear that must have been put into the hearts and minds of the women in those times, during those times, had to be so deep, because it went on for like 100 years, didn't it? It went on for a long time, and they still carry that. But maybe they don't understand what that fear is. But to this day, they carry that fear. And I know some that will practice. They'll come into our ceremonies with no problem whatsoever. They will come into our ceremonies, and they just marvel at some of the ways that we have our spiritual relationships. But their own, they'll hide it. They'll gather, but they'll hide it. They don't do it in the open. So that's that fear. So the fear has to be addressed, and can only be addressed by acknowledging that that's what it is. That's how they can address that fear, by saying this is where that fear came from. This is what happened to us as women back in those days. And it's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen anymore. So I think that it is possible if people are willing to make the change. But definitely, if we're going to go in another direction that has respect for all life, and I will tell you that I was told in a ceremony by a spirit, all things have a right to live, Alma. That's what was told to me. All things have a right to live, Alma. And it was it was told to me in such a kind voice. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a woman, it was just a voice.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you both for those responses. There's a couple of questions related to settler colonialism, and so in particular with Palestine. So I'm going to try to sort of put them into one. So, you know, a lot of folks are curious about how the Zionist movement tries to delegitimize the settler colonial analysis. And you know, there's also kind of a question, I guess, which ties into that, which is asking about the claims that the Jewish people are the original indigenous people of the land. And I think there are ways in which those two actually are kind of related as being one of the ways that the Zionist narrative tries. So I wanted to pass that over to you, Dr. Khalidi.
Yeah, they're linked questions, actually. In fact, exactly as you said, Yara, this claim of indigeneity by a largely European colonial settler population brought in by foreign powers is ludicrous on the face of it. There's obviously a connection between the Jewish religion and the land of Israel and ancient Palestine. But the idea of the Jews as a people with a national state is an entirely modern idea. This is a modern creation. This is not a recreation of ancient Israel. We have no idea what the DNA of ancient Israelites was, and whether there's any connection, in fact, at all between the DNA of people who mainly came from Russia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and other parts of Eastern and Central Europe, and are largely European, or others who later on were brought from the Middle East or fled from the Middle Eastern countries. And so one of the many tools to delegitimize and undermine the obviously true Palestinian claim of indigeneity is to say, A, we are the indigenous people, and B, the Palestinians are just rootless nomads who drifted in, or they arrived with the Islamic conquest, none of which is true. I mean, you have settled villages that have been in the same place for thousands of years. What the DNA of the people who lived in them is, or what their culture was, is a question archaeologists can answer. The problem here is that archaeology is also weaponized. A wonderful book by Nadia Abu-Hajj talking about how archaeology becomes a tool of colonialism in the Israeli case. So I think the best way to answer this argument about indigeneity is to say nobody who is today a modern Israeli has a great-great-great-grandparent who thought of the necessity of the entire Jewish people returning to the land of Israel. This is a modern notion. Even if there was, the idea of a return, of course, is again notional. But even if there was such a thing, this is a modern creation. This is a modern creation. The state of Israel has absolutely no connection with ancient Israel in terms of continuity in political terms, in terms of any more than the ancient Gauls have with modern French. Now, if you read French history in the 19th century, you were told that there was a connection. There isn't. The Gauls were actually a Germanic people, and probably there's some DNA from them and 50 other types of DNA in a modern French person. So that's probably true of a modern Israeli. It's probably also true of a modern Palestinian. All of these claims of ancient origin, if you actually look at people, I mean, just look at the people of Israel or look at the Palestinians. They look very different from one another, let alone and they certainly don't have a distinctive or unique. So these populations are a hybrid. And the idea that there is a unique strain going right back to the time of King Solomon or King David, if in fact there was a King Solomon and there was a King David. If you're a Christian, you perhaps believe that, or if in fact, if you're a Muslim or a Jew, you believe that. But as a scientist or as a historian, we're not sure. In any case, the idea that there is this ethnic continuity, this is a myth. This is a modern nationalist myth. And one of the saddest things is to see religion utilized and transformed in such a way as to justify a myth, which essentially is meant to explain and to justify the usurpation of a land from a people that's indigenous by a group of people coming from elsewhere.
Thank you so much for that answer. I know we're, a minute over time. I'm wondering if it's okay to ask just one more question. Um, is that okay? Is that okay with you, Alma? There's one
Oh,
more.
yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. It's almost impossible with Zoom webinars to ever keep it within the time frame. So I apologize for folks who were, and thank you all for your time. So there's a question here about this narrative of underdevelopment, and both of you touched on this as you were speaking, right? This kind of idea of making the desert bloom, for example, and so and the way in which colonial logics have always sort of the way that they've treated the indigenous population. I mean, Dr. Khalidi, you just used this imagination of lawless or wandering tribes almost, right, which we saw a lot with the early Zionist movement. And I know with the colonization of Turtle Island, oftentimes this idea of terra nullius, that the land was empty. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that in both cases, how that settler imagination of the land empty was mobilized against the indigenous peoples who live there.
Do you want to go first, Alma, or should I?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this is a really powerful trope. And if you look at all of the travel literature from the 19th century, it is, and you look at the way the British wrote in the 1920s and 30s after they took over Palestine, they were determined to make it appear that absolutely nothing was being done with this country by the indigenous population.
Yeah.
If you actually go and look at the terracing and you look at the use of the land by Palestinians, you will see that in fact a great deal was being done with the land. If you look at ancient villages, if you look at cities like Jerusalem or Nablus, the older cities in Palestine, it's very clear that there's a rooted population here for thousands of years, hundreds of years certainly. How long exactly, we don't know. It would take a different kind of archaeology and a different kind of work with DNA. But what is perfectly clear, simply from the terracing, simply from the buildings, simply from talking to Palestinians. I mean, I write in my book about our family. We know that we trace our connection to Jerusalem, in the case of my own family, back to either immediately after the Crusades, which means the 13th or 14th century, or possibly just before the Crusades, which means the 11th century. And that's just one family, which happens to have some records. Most villages have populations that are similarly ancient, 1,000 years, 1,200 years. You look at Ottoman, you look at Ayyubid, you look at Mamluk registers, and you'll find the same villages are there. 58 families, and then later on 60 families, and then later on fewer, and then later on more. So very clearly, there is a rooted population in and on the land. A proportion of the population was nomadic, but actually a minority in Palestine. And even those nomadic peoples had clear, defined, they call it a dira, the area within which they moved and where they had property rights. So even the minority that was nomadic was rooted in a certain region. It was a much broader region, but most of the population was either in cities or towns or villages. And those people were neither nomadic, nor did they misuse or underuse or underutilize the land. Now, what is modern European exploitation more intensive? Of course it is, and Alma has spoken to that. As we're now told by climate scientists, this involves abuse of the land. So this is not just correct use. In fact, it is not correct use. The people who were irrigating the way they irrigated and building terraces in the way they built terraces and using water as they used water were actually using the land correctly. And modern exploitation of the land has emptied the Dead Sea, has created all kinds of serious environmental crises, not just in Palestine, obviously, because we're talking about capitalism, which is universal. Colonialism is just one branch of a larger world system. And that is what's destroying the planet, this overconsumption of resources, so we can have more Amazon packages and more plastic and poison more water and cut down more trees. This is actually part of what the pioneers, the Zionist pioneers, were proud to be doing: draining swamps, destroying ecosystems, planting eucalyptus trees, which are not natural to Palestine. I could go on and on and on. These were seen as great achievements of the colonizers, and in fact were central elements in the degradation of the environment of the country.
Yes, that's so true. Here, the first thing that was done here when they arrived on our shores was to take our names off. They started to map territory on the river, and they took our names off and put their names on, and basically just rendered us invisible in our own land, because they sent those maps to England, or and so they never, but we had large populations here. We used all of our land. We were not nomadic. We were more migratory, because we went to certain places to fish. We went to certain places for winter. We hunted moose in certain places. So every extended family had a nobody, like, we owned the land together. It was a collective right. Nobody, it was private property, was not a part of our concept. We used the land. That was the way we used the land, was to go to certain places for certain things. We knew where the medicines were that we needed for the winter. We had a winter camp. We had summer camp. So, and for even right up until my mother's day, certain families would go to certain places on the river to make baskets, or to collect sweetgrass, or to gather medicines. And it was a way of life. It was a way of life, and our land was all a part of that way of life. And she gave to us freely. She was very generous to us. And in fact, some of the colonial writers had to wrote down that it was like a paradise here when they arrived. Well, they took care of that pretty quick, because it's certainly not a paradise here now, with the clear cutting and the spraying of glyphosate and other poisons all over the place. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much for both of you for those responses. There's so many questions that people had that we couldn't get to, but I think I hope that what we've been able to do today is really show the links between settler colonialism from Turtle Island to Palestine. And so I'm really thankful to everyone who joined us today, and all of our endorsers, and to both of you, Dr. Rashid Khalidi and Alma. Thank you both so much for being here with us today and sharing all your wisdom with us. As we do this work, I am reminded of someone that we lost earlier just a few weeks ago, Lee Maracle, who was an Indigenous feminist and writer. And Lee fought against the colonization of Turtle Island, and also stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And so I was trying a little bit ago to upload a link of a poem that Lee wrote, actually honoring Mahmoud Darwish, who she met in the chat, but the chat function wasn't supporting it. So I promised to upload that poem to an email to everyone who signed up today and share it with you all, because it's just a really beautiful poem, and I think speaks to this long legacy of co-resistance and solidarity that our movements have always had with one another. And so I guess I just wanted to see if either of you had any closing remarks. Natalie is actually going to close us off in just a small bit of a song, but I wanted to see if either of you had closing remarks before I passed it over to her.
I just want to thank everybody who was involved in organizing this event, and it was wonderful to listen to Alma. I learned a great deal from hearing the things that she had to say.
Well, I have to say the same thing. I really enjoyed the webinar, and thank you so much for including me as a part of the your panel, and thank everybody who joined us, and And I really enjoyed Dr. Khalidi's talk, and I'm so happy. It makes me happy to see that the truth is finally coming to the surface.
Finally.
Finally. And I am in also solidarity with the Palestinian people. Certainly I am.
And I, of course, with the First Nations.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And I think we know that our liberation is intertwined. And I think tonight really exemplifies that. So I'm just going to pass it over to Natalie. And I guess I'll let you explain what song you're going to sing to us.
I will be singing Molteni, which is now regarded as a Palestinian anthem. It was originally written for Iraq, and it became such a prominent song across the Levant because of the imperialism that has really just taken over the Levant region, and Palestinians in particular really made this song a part of our resistance and our wishes and hopes for going back to our homeland. There is a word called watan in our language, and I don't know how to explain it because it encapsulates not only many people regard it as a nationalistic word, but for many of us, for me, it's not really nationalistic. It's really a word that encapsulates my love for my homeland, for the nature that it brings, and the offerings that it generously brings for our livelihoods, and that it has allowed us to live through generations in the Levant. So Watan is the Molteni is for me about that. It's about transcending our understanding of borders and going back to our connection with our land, free of all of this colonialism and imperialism. So I'll just sing it. موطني موطني الجلال والجمال والسناء والبهاء في رباك والحياة والنجاة والهناء والرجاء في هواك هل أراك سالما منعما وغالما مكرما سالما منعما وغالما مكرما هل أراك في علاك تبلغ سماك موطني الحسام واليراع لا الكلام والنزاع مجدنا وعهدنا واجب من الوفا يهزنا عزنا غاية تشرف وراية ترفرف غاية تشرف وراية ترفرف يا هنا